And we're going to be going over some things that apply to each of the types today. Some things that are an important part of the whole picture.
Yeah, and basically we're going to give you one piece of new content and then going into more depth about some what we talked about before, which hopefully will make more sense now that we've gotten to where we've gotten to.
And then, as we said, there will be 2 additional parts of this. One is a one-on-one meeting with each of you. And the second part is, now what, so what? So you've been exploring the Enneagram, how you're going to come together and apply this to working together. But today is day 4, and this is, you can see the kinds of things we're going to do today.
Yeah, and also just as a reminder, the Enneagram is a map to our gifts and our habits and patterns. And we started to cover this. This is kind of the deeper part of the Enneagram, that when we lose touch with the beingness of the gifts, that those gifts are who we are, we don't have to do anything to make them happen, we start imitating them. And also that disconnection gets felt by each type differently, and that's the emotional energy of the type. Or if you read other Enneagram books, the passions of the type. So, 8's disconnection generates a sense of intensity, 9's a sense of sloth, 1's a sense of resentment, etc. around the Enneagram. But all of us are sort of desperately trying to reclaim the highest qualities of our type in ways that don't work until we have a self-awareness practice. So that's why we want to first talk about the levels of freedom and awareness a bit more, and then talk more about the kind of practice that's needed to bring out the best in all of us.
Yeah, and also to give you the most freedom to share those gifts you were born with, that optimizes the contributions that we can make, all of us.
So we showed you these slides when we first started, and the page numbers are up there if you want to look also at your workbooks and add any notes.
We encourage you to have your notebooks open.
Yeah. It's just important to really get that where we are in this type is totally based on self-awareness. And as we'll go into later on, the only way to be up here is with a self-awareness practice. It doesn't happen on its own. It doesn't happen naturally. Without self-awareness, the best place we can be is high average, which is, as our friend Russ says, a nice day without self-awareness.
And that's tough, because we'll run into things over and over again that are challenges, and we won't have satisfying ways to deal with them unless we're aware that certain things are going to poke at us, certain habits and patterns will poke at us to act, and we need to have the choice, don't we, to have true freedom about how we react to situations. And we sent you the article on having goals, having plans, taking action, and reflecting. And what we want to say is high performance is not available. And high performance is really, if we were to summarize it just clearly, that's where we do have that kind of freedom that we need to really make choices, not just patterned ones. But high performance is only available if we're aware of what it is that we can and want to contribute, not just for ourselves, obviously, but for others as well. And then if the practice we keep talking about is that we set a plan in place, what could help us carry out those kinds of gifts. And how do we do? And that doesn't mean that we chastise ourselves and get upset with ourselves. It's a way to learn. Unfortunately, a lot of organizations don't translate mistakes or not being clear as a way to learn. And that's what this is.
Yeah, and we're going to be saying a lot of things today, at least in this part that we've said before, but it just bears repeating. And one of them is that most of us go through our day 95 to 99% of the time in automatic pilot, in habit mode. We are not self-aware and reflective and watching what's going on while we're acting. It doesn't mean we're doing bad things, doesn't mean we're not being of service to others. but we're not awakened here. Our brains are designed that way. Our brains are designed to run on habit, on cheap fuel. And because each one of us has an emotional energy that drives our pattern, 9 very different flavors, but we all have one, that emotional energy will drive our behavior in a way that's not optimal unless we have the kind of awareness practice that Sandra's talking about, and where we many times throughout the day wake ourselves up with what actually matters right now. And as we mentioned in that short article, this doesn't work without having a goal of who we want to be as a human being, as a leader. It's important enough to challenge patterns, because whatever the Enneagram type is of each one of us, it's sometimes really hard to go against the flow of the pattern and to take action aligned with what really matters to us. And if we're not in touch with what really matters, we can't do it. So we're going to show you these levels in a couple different ways. We showed this to you last time, that unless we're an amazing people, most of us are at best at high performance, which is a really good self-aware place. Most people are in the average range because it's average, and hopefully we don't dip down very much into level 7. It's very unusual to find humans who live much at level 1 and 2 or 8 and 9, unless you go to prisons or mental hospitals to the bottom. And,
well, and with average, a lot of people would be in that average range, low average range, because they've never been introduced to an opportunity like this. And as we all can agree, school is not necessarily about, and sometimes our families aren't about, self-awareness. And so then we default to the kinds of habits and patterns, as we've said many times, that we formed at a very early age before we can evaluate them cognitively about the wisdom of them.
Yeah. And so one of the ways of looking at this is that every Enneagram type has a story. We could go around the Enneagram, Enneagram 8, we started with that. The story is the world's a dangerous place. People would take advantage of me if I'm not strong. Enneagram 9 has a very different story about, in order to fit in, I have to somehow not value my own needs and just create comfort and harmony, and then I fit in. Enneagram 1's story, most people in the world are just not ethical and focused enough on what really matters, and so the world needs people like me to point out the defects and flaws so the world can be a better place.
Otherwise, there's imperfection.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And we all have so every type has a story. If you think you know your Enneagram type, it's really important for you to get what the story is of that type, because you will always be a character in that story if you're not self-aware, in the same way as you will always project onto other people the other roles. So like we mentioned, Enneagram 1, in order for you to be to be the person pointing out defects, they have to be defective people around you. And so other people get to play that role, or you project on them how defective they are.
Or you heard us say 2s, 3s, and 4s can feel shame if they're not living up to that story they're supposed to be living up to. So a 2, if you don't need them, they can feel real shame at that low average level, because that's what they're here for, is to be needed.
Yeah, and
that's the story. That isn't necessarily at all the actuality.
And even deeper for the Enneagram 2, I'm not lovable, and I have to prove my lovability by how helpful I am. So we could go through all 9. But the point is that at high performance, I recognize that. I can watch it play out. At the average level, I'm identified with it.
It's true.
It's kind of my life.
That's what it means by I'm identified. I'm convinced that's who I am.
Yeah, and at acute and chronic stress, even more, I am my story without any room to move, basically. I'm totally locked into that. So, and you can see that there's maximum degrees of freedom at high performance. At the average level, that leads to defensiveness, justification, reactivity. And at acute chronic stress, compulsive behavior.
The only thing that's a little misleading about this is this looks like I know there's a story. at the low average level, even at the average level in general. I don't know it's a story. Those are my lenses through which I see the world, and that's the way it is. And it's absolutely true with acute and chronic stress. So humans aren't thinking, wait a minute, I have a story. To what degree is it accurate? That takes high level reflection and development so that I have the choice. I don't berate myself because I identified with a certain story. It was probably needed for safety or comfort, whatever, when I was little. But I need to know that it's a story. So this is just a tiny bit misleading in that I am my story. Well, I think it's reality. Absolutely.
That's right. That's a good point. And this is another way of looking at the same thing. It may be overkill, circles of freedom, that at high performance, you see what it says, I practice self-awareness regularly. And because of that, I have a great deal of freedom to be who I want to be in life.
And be what I want for others, what I want to contribute for others. Because we talk a lot about if you have a meeting to go to that you've had issues with before where you feel like it just hasn't been how I want it to be, or I haven't been, then when you set that goal of how you do want it to be and what you want to contribute for others, and you have that plan, then when you reflect on that, you have an opportunity to apply what you've learned and celebrate what you've accomplished.
Yeah, and we'll go through these briefly. It's basically saying the same thing, but you get the feel of what high performance is. I'm aware of my patterns. That lets me express a higher side in general, which is very different from average. Let's say I'm an automatic pilot. Sometimes things go well. Sometimes I am that personality. And like Sandra said, at average, you're not aware of this. This is what's true if you're like the, I don't know what the part about being the connection, watch what's going on, even though we're not aware of it at this level. And if chronic stress, the person wouldn't know this, like you said, Sandra. But this is what's true. My thoughts, feelings, and behavior just take control of me, whether that's addictions, whether that's aggression. There is no separation between me and my patterns.
And I don't really know there's an option. Okay.
Yeah.
And hold on for a second. That doesn't mean that we all don't at some point in our lives have acute and chronic stressful things taking place. But at the high level, what would you imagine I can do with acute and chronic stress from what you're hearing? What would be my options?
The ability to recognize the situation as a whole, as opposed to just how it's affecting you.
Absolutely.
To bounce back from out of that scenario?
Absolutely. I have that option.
And a way of summarizing everything that we just showed is that at high performance, I have a personality, and at low average to below, my personality has me.
Yeah, again, it's a little misleading with that word performance, isn't it? This isn't a performance I am putting on. This is how I'm showing up. That's how that word is used.
Yeah, and this next slide is kind of busy. We want you to take a couple of minutes and look at it, because this is what the Enneagram is all about, is how can we live more, at least at level 3, and really recognizing when we're at each one of those levels. And so we're going to give you a couple of minutes to read through this, and then break you up into probably 2 groups, 2 or 3, and just see what strikes you about it, because this is why we do the Enneagram. It's learning our patterns, learning the feel of the patterns, being able to watch them gives us more freedom to be at the higher levels of the type. So to take a couple of minutes.
And more freedom to not just in other situations, but at work, to create a healthy culture, organizational culture, because the organizational culture, as you know, is formed by what leaders pay attention to, and then supplemented in many other ways.
Who'd like to share from the first group? Whichever
Any
group.
comments, questions?
I'm the designated speaker, from what I understand. In absentia, apparently the vote occurred, but that's okay. So we had a moment just at first where we just sort of shared with each other and showed our caring to each other. And just because I guess we don't see each other as often as we should. So we took probably half our time to do that. Sorry for intruding on this, but we also noticed that when we were looking through all of the massive amounts of text on that page, I think we all sort of went right to the level of the pain in the ass there, which kind of hits for all of us, I think, especially when we're dealing with other coworkers or, you know, just anyone in our lives, basically. And I think we all sort of agreed that this Enneagram, we kind of went higher level a bit. The Enneagram and its methodology seem to show sort of more of a self-reflective base to it, where much more so than any of the other ones that we've done in the past, where we really need to kind of dig in and really be aware of who we are and how we behave, and instinctively and in practice, and to just sort of develop self-reflective practices that would be sort of ongoing and always like a TSR running throughout our whole day, I'd imagine. So we didn't have any questions. I don't think our team had any questions. We sort of knew it all is really how it all.
Well, and there was a clarity that these are levels of development, nuances and levels of development.
And I just want to add, what you said is so good, Mary, because every other assessment that we know is presented as flatland. You know, if you're an ISTJ, this is who you are.
In Myers-Briggs.
Yeah. If you take the DISC, if you're a high D, high I, low S, middle C, here's who you are. And it doesn't give that level of, you know, that whole vertical dimension where you can understand how Saddam Hussein and Mother Teresa are the same type. Where you can understand the pain people are in to be at that level of the pain in the ass. You know, there's a beautiful perspective that's very hard to hold, at least in my experience.
Can I ask how you know these people are those types?
Yeah, that's
they all have all the parts. I don't really understand how you.
It's a very good question, because it's a shorthand when we say that. It's a good question. Some people actually have typed themselves on the Enneagram, but other times it's people who do a lot of research, biographies, autobiographies, writings, to the point where they really get a sense of what's driving somebody. You know, there's people that spend a lot of time on that. So, for example, it would be very hard to read Einstein's biography, at least the long one from a few years ago, and not get the qualities of Enneagram 5 in there. So we should say, I want to acknowledge what you were saying, we should say, from all indications, these people are these
That's
types.
right. That's right.
It's a good point. Yeah. How about the second group?
Yeah, let's hear from the second group. Any comments, questions? What were your reactions to these?
So I guess I've sort of heard the like health and stress defined differently in the Enneagram. Before, I think when I was originally introduced to the Enneagram, they talk about like you tend to go to like in stress, like sixes go to 9 or 3, and in health they go to 9.
Correct.
And so I've more heard like the health stress dichotomy in that context, rather than the way you guys have presented it as like really about self-awareness.
Yeah, it's such a good comment, because you're right. Even, I mean, this points out some of the things we should probably change, because acute and chronic stress, people only go there if they're victim to it, if they're subject to it, if they're not self-aware. There's clearly the examples of, I can't remember, there's this book called Joy that's a dialogue between the Dalai Lama and I think Desmond Tutu or something. And people who have watched awful things happen right in front of them, but it didn't impact the level they were functioning at. And so I think what you're saying is good.
Yeah.
It's even acute and chronic stress. That doesn't mean that whenever we're under stress, we go there. It's that that's where we go without self-awareness and development.
And we don't have options. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay.
So
Yeah,
I think your comment is a really good one. This is the Enneagram. You see, one of the reasons we wanted to keep doing this is that most people use the Enneagram like a party game. Oh, I read these types. Oh, I think you're a 7. Oh, I think you're a 1. Oh, we watched this movie. What types do you think they were playing?
Mhm.
And that's useless for personal development. The inside out job is, once we know our type, can we feel it in ourselves? Can we feel when it's turned up? Can we feel when it's turned down? Can we notice the things that are about to come out of our mouth that are typical of our type and have choice? It's all about the inside experience.
But you're bringing up incredibly important points. And what is important for all of us to pay attention to is, even if we're under acute and chronic stress, we have more options that are constructive at the high level. I hope you hear that. At the average level, we're going to be a prototype of our type, and we're not going to have as many options as at high level. And at the lowest level, we're not going to even realize we have options. Okay. All right. So that's really important. Okay.
Yeah. There's I can mention this because I don't think we'll get to this, but one of the pieces of curriculum we use sometimes is we show an amazing statement from someone who's a very high level 1, who's talking about his experience under stress and how anger and resentment can eat you up unless you can find forgiveness and gratitude. And it's a quote from Sidney Poitier's autobiography. Someone who reached a remarkable level of development, it seems, in his life. And so someone like that can have huge stress going on and still be exhibiting the flowering of that personality type.
All right. So then, like Joel says, what are you hearing determines whether or not you're practicing?
Yeah.
And what are options open to you so you can practice, so you have the options to function at a high level?
Can you say that again?
Yes.
What does practice mean to you?
Yeah. We keep saying practice. And a couple different times we find it. But what are you hearing?
Yeah.
What kind of practice is being talked about here? What do you need to do to make sure that you have options?
Yeah. What is a practice, at least as we're talking about?
And what are you hearing when we talk about practice?
Like self-reflection, being aware of how you're thinking and behaving.
That's
definitely part of it.
That definitely is part of it. So a lot of times we just go on automatic pilot, right? And we just act, and we're not asking ourselves, and especially if we get feedback where it didn't land well or it landed exceptionally well. If we want to reinforce that higher level development, we need to reflect, whoa, I wonder what drove that reaction.
Yeah, and there's two important parts of reflection. One of them is, do we even have the ability to? So when people grow up in more challenging childhoods, they often come out of that unable to reflect, as in, if you ask somebody to write a diary and have them track what they were thinking and feeling, they're actually not able to do that.
But let's take that word ability. And it doesn't mean they can't develop the capacity, but what we all have to realize is, if I'm never invited to learn about that capacity to reflect, I'm not going to have that option. It doesn't mean I couldn't if I was introduced.
Yeah, but the point is that having the ability to reflect, just like the ability to play a musical instrument or to get better at a sport, is the actual capacity to do that has to be developed over time. So whether I actually can step back, watch my thoughts and feelings and body sensations, watch my personality without being my personality, is an acquired capacity over time. But then even if we have the capacity, we have to make time for it. So even if you're somebody who's quite capable of watching your thoughts and feelings, and you've had some kind of a mindfulness or meditation practice, and you can do that, functionally, if we don't make many times in a day to wake up, even though we have that capacity, we're not using that capacity. So there's two really important parts of reflection. One of them is, are we able to? And again, everyone can develop that. Some people take some more time. And the second is, are we making time for that? And so the reason why we had you read that short article about building capacity in 1 minute a day is that that's all it really takes. If we're aware of what really matters, you know, like, why would I practice? What am I serving? Who do I want to be? What impact do I want to have on the world, on my family, on me? And then if we have those many cycles throughout the day of what's my goal for this interaction? Sandra's talked about perspective taking on. In the article, we said when you have a goal, it's not just here's what I want to get done, but what do I want the experience to be of the people who I'm interacting with? And that's whether you called the meeting or whether you're a member of the meeting. Then a plan to have that happen, which hopefully includes taking perspective of ourselves. The Enneagram is really useful in that. When I'm working with people and I have my goal, my plan often involves being aware of the lower qualities of my Enneagram type. And then action and reflection. Well, there's also two kinds of reflection. One of them is reflecting myself. How do I think this went? You know, it'd be like at the end of these 2 hours. But I also might say to Sandra, how do you think it went? Or how do you think I showed up on this? So that's perspective seeking. And so that's why we say that in all the literature on building capacity, building who we are as human beings, reflection, perspective taking, and perspective seeking are the three key ingredients.
Well, and there's some tricky aspects to this that we're often not introduced to. And one is, as we've pointed out quite a few times, we have a negativity bias in our brains, which neurobiologists will tell us that's probably what kept the human race alive as it is. So we have that negativity bias, but we form those habits and patterns when we're very, very young. And so we go to some workshop and we hear, oh, I can see certain habits and patterns associated to how I function. I'm just going to stop those. What do you think happens when we just try to stop long-standing patterns?
Routine, the limbic system.
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
Decision.
That's right. There will be a discomfort. So we would not be responsible if we were just saying, well, here's the habits and patterns associated to your Enneagram type. Now just stop doing them. Nuh-uh. We have to be aware of how the brain works. And we have to be aware that we have the option to learn and have more possibilities, but only with the practice, like we've both been pointing out. Here's what I'm going to go do. What's my goal for how I want to show up, what I want for others, for example. What's my plan? And then afterwards, how did it go? And not, again, so many of us have learned to chastise ourselves if it didn't go as we thought it should. The most important thing here is, what did I learn? And what can I do next time for that to go even better?
Yeah, and one more comment. Who was it who said something about the limbic system?
Mary.
Yeah. Originally the limbic system would get, which people who don't know, at least the amygdala, which is part of the limbic system, gets triggered from threat. And originally that was, the expected threats, the saber-toothed tiger is bearing down on me, or there's a neighboring tribe trying to kill me. But the Enneagram maps really well the 9 very different ways we get triggered by things that are not like that, but it feels just as visceral. So, an 8 who feels like someone's trying to control me or threaten me. A 9 who feels like the world is stopping me from feeling comfortable or is disturbing my sense of serenity. An Enneagram 1, I'm being told that there's something bad about me or wrong. In Enneagram 2, you're rejecting my help, which makes me feel like I'm not lovable. In Enneagram 3, I feel like I'm being told I didn't succeed, I didn't do well, I failed at something. In Enneagram 4, you're not special. You're just an average run-of-the-mill human being like everybody else. In Enneagram 5, that was a dumb idea. That'll trigger a 5 in a way that's very different than a 9. An Enneagram 6. Things could, a sense that things are falling apart out of control. In Enneagram 7, the world's trying to trap me. I'm constrained. Things could happen that make me feel like I don't have freedom. Those trigger our amygdala just as much or more as that saber-toothed tiger. And so, again, part of the value of learning the Enneagram. Any comments before we move on to the next piece of curriculum? Comments, questions?
Okay.
Anything you want to add?
No,
Okay.
not at this point.
So this is a really interesting area called the Instinctual Variants. And it's separate from the Enneagram, so it's not a subset of the Enneagram. Some people sort of share it that way, but I know, again, our friend Russ Hudson usually shares the Instinctual Variants first, and then looks at the 9 Enneagram types as 9 different ways that these instincts play out. These slides are on page 57 to 60 of your workbook if you'd like to do that or make notes. Oh.
42 and 43 is what I have in this notebook.
Which is very similar to
you should have
57 to 60.
You should, on one of those pages, you should have instinctual variants.
I'm glad I'm not an Enneagram 1.
Up at the upper left.
It's 56
Oh,
to
it is.
57.
Older book.
Okay.
Okay.
No, you do have an old book. Okay, so.
I do have an old book.
Phew, I was right.
Okay.
I achieved. Oh, God, another moment without shame. Okay. But this is really significant. So whether you start with the Enneagram or you start with the Instinctual Variants, the Instinctual Variants are our biological hardwiring. It's animal kingdom, wild kingdom. It's 3 different drives that all of us have. So this isn't that some of us have them and some of them don't. And we'll describe them in detail soon. But the point is that each one of us will have one that we overly focus on. This is why I made a joke about the meatball sub. It does not mean you're a self-pres type or a preserving instinct. But I'm a self-pres type, and I think about food all the time, or what I'm going to have next, or will it be a meal, and what do I want on the buffet? So maybe you. So we have one that we over-focus on, and our Enneagram type plays through that. Okay, so
you have all 3, and one of these generally shows up more than the other 2.
And one of them is usually pretty in balance, and one of them tends to be a blind spot. We tend to underdo it, and after we go through the Instinctual Variants, we'll talk about why the one that we tend to underdo is really, really important. And so as we're going through this, we want you to try to get a sense of what's your stacking. The stacking is, the three. The
What
overdone,
order? Yeah.
The one we focus on too much, the one that seems like it's just right, and the one that we tend to underdo. Because then we'll get you into small groups to talk a little bit about what you noticed. And there's different names for these if you read different Enneagram things. The words we have on here come from Mario Sikora. Most people call the transmitting instinct, well, probably at least half Enneagram authors call it the sexual subtype. But then people go, oh, you're in business, you can't talk about a word like sex because, people have. But it is the energy of sex, whatever you call it, it's still the energy of sex. And these are the 3 basic, you watch Wild Kingdom, animals are copulating, animals are fighting each other. Animals are getting along in a herd. You know, there's basic energies going on. Animals are trying to see, do I have enough food, shelter? Will I be safe? So we're going to go through them, and this is really what we said already.
Take a look at what's in the book as well as what's on our slide.
Yeah, and when you look on these slide, and again, this is preserving or sometimes called self-preservation. It doesn't mean that all three of these are equally important to you. Even within preserving types, usually one of these will be strong, one would be medium, and one will be relatively a blind spot. But overall, if you're a preserving type, one of these is very, very important. And it's what you tend to focus on more than anything else.
Now, again, we said you'll have all three of these, the preserving, the transmitting, and the navigating. But so you'll have some of this, but as you read through this, how important are these aspects of the preserving to you?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And if you're, and particularly if it's something you overdo, is it something you tend to obsess about sometimes? Is it something where it dominates your thinking? Because as we'll show you, if you are a preserving type, preserving 3 will look very different than a preserving 6, but it's the same core biological drive with a different energy.
Yeah, with the Enneagram flavor.
Yeah.
Okay.
So you can see the 3 types. And again, it doesn't, I just want to reiterate, it doesn't mean all 3 of these, but one of these really dominates you. And you can see preserving is focused on me. Am I safe? Do I have enough food? Do I have enough shelter? You know, the domesticity, you know, I'm building a nest. I'm building a comfortable place to live. Practicality. I like taking care of stuff, or maybe I overfocus too much on that. You know, Sandra will talk about on the first bullet that I can have a tendency to acquire way too many supplements, for example, or to overdo exercise. Or I'm definitely a preserving type. And next slide.
And what I want to point out is nothing wrong with being any one of these 3. It's when one of these 3 takes precedence to the point where the other 2 or one of the other 2 don't exist. To be a healthy, high-functioning being, we have to have all 3 of these, okay? And we need to know, let's assume that I'm a person that just can't stand all this stuff about having to pay bills and you know, take care of basic kinds of things like that because it's too boring. But then if I'm getting all kinds of input that's not working, I need to be willing to pay attention to that and build some preserving priorities, not at the expense of what I really am clearly committed to, but to know the cost of not having a commitment here or overcommitment.
Yeah,
Okay.
so it's important on this slide you're seeing here is imbalance probably means, not always, but probably means it's your second in your stack. It means you handle this well. You don't overdo it, you don't underdo it, it's not too hot, not too cold, you do it just right. The out of balance could be because you focus on it way too much or not nearly enough.
So just ask yourself as you read these, what is most accurate as far as you know? And in some cases, you'll need to just start paying attention to see, because it does really influence how you show up, these instincts.
And here's the last one, which is at least one person's theory on how preserving leaders tend to show up. You know, I'm not just focused on my own security and comfort. I'm also doing that for the people around me.
What are you taking in that's really positive about the preserving me and the preserving leader? What's really positive?
It looks like the basics are getting taken care of, so the person will continue to survive, which is
Yeah, this is very much.
Or what happens if the preserving leader starts obsessing over these have to happen at the expense of the others?
Well, any imbalance creates a problem. So in this case, having read the other ones, no change would ever occur.
if you have any control over that. Yes, you're right.
Yeah.
Okay.
And sometimes the way these things play out, you can notice it even playfully, like, again, because I'm a preserving type or self-preservation, different words for that. If we're doing a workshop you remember when we did that workshop in that church on, was that 109th Street downtown?
Anybody remember that?
Gary, remember? That was quite a few years back. I don't know who else was part of that. But it was a room that had some couches, some chairs, some easy chairs. As a self-pres, I immediately went to, where do I want to sit? Okay, I got to throw something down on that chair really quick because I want this chair that just is going to be comfortable to me. I mean, that's kind of the way it can play out. Just, there's some part of you that's always looking toward where will I be comfortable. Any questions about the preserving instinct so far? Behind door number 2 is the transmitting instinct. This is the one that's called sexual subtype in a lot of, in
A
fact,
lot of books on the Enneagram will call it sex.
in fact, the reports you get will give their sense of your stacking on these 3. Doesn't mean it's right, so you can see if it relates to, if it's the same as you're going to think at the end of today. But it's often called the sexual subtype. And here the focus, instead of on me, is on you and the interaction that we're having. And so you can see the energy of activation. You can see why it's called the sexual subtype. Building up of energy and then release of it. Nice
And the
metaphor.
charisma of the leaders, kinds of things that you're reading here.
Yeah. Transmitting types make better cult leaders. Probably the majority of successful politicians are probably transmitting types. Again, charismatic, energy that comes out of their eyes.
And it's not, charisma obviously is not negative. It's when it's overused to convince and take advantage, but it doesn't have to be.
Yeah, and so you can see, is there one of these here that you do a lot? Activation, again, like I'm having a connection with you and there's only me and you in the world. We all love one-on-one interaction. It's not about that, but it's like being glued onto somebody and into this.
So I go into a room with a whole lot of people. Do I tend to overprivilege going to one-on-one encounters, or do I tend to want to just be in the big group?
Yeah, and again, that's one part of it. There's also, even if it's one-on-one, is it casual or is there an intensity to it?
And it doesn't have to be sexual,
No.
but it's a connection that is demanded.
And it doesn't have to be people. I'm thinking about an organization we work with in Boston, where one of the leaders was, in his spare time, a race car driver, and pretty high level. He was, that's also activation, intensity of experience. Broadcasting, like plumage, in a way. Like I'm very aware. It's like a what I want to say, animal with colored feathers.
What?
My
I mean, a
mind.
peacock?
Thank you, peacock. I knew I was looking.
Did
for
I respond correctly?
Yeah. No, I kept having pelican. I knew the P was right,
no,
but it was not a pelican.
Not the
Okay.
pelican.
Anyway, yeah, it's a peacock. It's that sense of, attractiveness and attraction. And again, immersion. When I'm doing something, I'm totally into it.
Yeah, but what we don't want to do, we're giving you some really strong examples. That doesn't mean that the transmitting isn't very reasonable, and it's just a different way of approaching the world than the preserving. Even though we need some aspects of all 3, you can probably see, to function effectively. So just because I tend to have a lot of charisma doesn't mean there's a problem or you're being a peacock. But it is something, if you're trying to explain what it is, that you get the picture. Okay.
You can see what it is, because again, when it's in balance, which is what Sandra's talking about, this is just part of functioning as a human being.
So what would happen if it was way out of balance and the person was way too much into being transmitting as a leader?
Well, you can see some of the out of balance below. You can see the addicted to romance, adrenaline, excitement. That's someone where this is their top one, the one that's most out of balance. Or the bottom bullet, obsessively or energetically dead, is somebody who most denies this area. They just, their life doesn't have excitement, doesn't have intensity. Because to a certain extent, that's part of being alive, enjoying going out and doing things that are different. So if you're somebody where you think your life is really flat and you're just not drawn to, or maybe you're even drawn to some activities that would be more energetically activating, but you always find reasons not to do it. This could be your blind spot.
And the imbalance is a real gift, right? Giving real gifts. So you see the imbalance aspects. Any comments on the transmitting?
And just to add this one about transmitting leaders and then take questions. You see, it's very different, engaging people in goals and visions.
It doesn't mean the other two can't be good at reading customer needs, can't be good at some of these, but these characteristics you see on this page really do stand out for transmitting leaders, where this is the dominant of the three. It doesn't mean the other two don't exist.
This is called social, navigating in this model, adapting. And you can see the three main areas: bonding, connecting, belonging, loyalty.
Where do I fit in the herd?
Yeah, receiving and sending cues. This would be reading people, letting myself be read, tuning into people, and participating, contribution, altruism. We had a really, I think, at least for people that take Enneagram assessment, social tends to be somewhat lower than the other two. But a few years ago, we were doing a workshop for leaders in the pipeline industry. And most all these people have spent a lot of their time living in camps with other people, intensively, 2 weeks on, a week off, 2 weeks on, 2 weeks off, whatever it might be. But they were drawn to that kind of a life. And they were hugely oriented towards social subtype. They were comfortable in that. They liked that sense of being part of a group. And they talked about even when they came home from their intense time there, they would hang out with their partner, spouses, a short period of time, and then, so that's enough, and I'm gonna go hang out with my friends, more social focus. You can see what it's like in balance. Again, really important skill.
Yeah, all three are very important.
One of the ways of telling if this is a blind spot is if, I don't see any reason to be around people unless there's something that I need to get from it. I'll go to that networking event because I need some customers, but hanging out with people in a crowd, that seems fluffy and superficial, and you don't get the depths of that one-on-one encounter that I like, perhaps. And here's a version of navigating leaders. Cohesion, politics.
And again, you have to take a look at all the characteristics, not just say one bullet, attuned to organizational politics. That doesn't mean that you're a navigating leader. The other things have to exist as well.
We're going to break you into two groups in a minute, or maybe three, and just have you talk about what do you think your stacking is. So if you have any questions, ask us first. I wanted to add one piece that I said briefly at the beginning. It's really useful to see which one of these our type plays through excessively. Because usually that's what ends up causing discomfort in our lives. And again, every Enneagram type will play out differently among these three. But it's very hard to stop doing what we're doing too much of. And it turns out that the best way to balance these in our lives is to work on the underdeveloped one. So the reason why it's important to know the stacking is to focus attention on the one that we tend to neglect, on the blind spot.
Stacking in as what's most important to me of these three, what's second and what's third.
Yeah.
That's the stacking. And are there some blind spots for me because of one of these that I need to be aware of?
And again, the top doesn't mean we do it well. It tends to be overdone, out of balance, focused on too
Can
much.
be, it doesn't have to be. It can be a real gift. But again, that's usually pretty consistent with development, high level development average.
Yeah. Okay. So before we break you into groups, talk about what you notice. Any comments?
Questions?
I have a question.
Yeah.
When we talk about these three,
Hmm.
basically you're saying that instinctively we would kind of identify more with one, or that would be sort of more prevalent, obviously. But
Right.
is it sort of like the 1 to 9 scale like this, where you should at a high level have all three operating perfectly
Absolutely.
in balance?
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah. The reason for seeing what's done too much and what's done too little is to have them be more in balance, because you can see on those slides where it said, what's it like when they're in balance? The goal is to have all three be in balance. Yeah, because they're all basic human/animal needs.
Well, and I like how you're raising that we do have all 9 types in us as well. And it doesn't mean that we have to scurry around and try to make sure that we're well developed in all 9, but also to recognize when aspects of the 9 we're in a place that it's serving us and others, and where it's in the way.
Yeah.
Does that answer your question?
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, and so once we know the Enneagram type and we know our instinctual variant, then watching how they play out becomes important. Let's give you a quick example. We did an Enneagram training years ago, and there were enough people there so that there was a lot of the connections. And I was the self-preservation, preserving Enneagram 3. My focus growing up was grades. It was, material things, not flashy, just having things, but grades who had how to shut up. Then there was a friend of ours who was this totally charismatic real estate guy, always looking airbrushed perfection, his hair, his looks, he was always complaining about the women he was having to fight off. His image was like, here I am. It's like a Tom Cruise kind of 3. Tom Cruise certainly seems like a 3, and that kind of a look, I'm here. And then there was a woman who's from Spain, who had the most amazing collection of friends. She knew everybody. She was a social 3. It was all about who she knew and the crowd she was in and the parties she was invited to. So it was more important to be invited to those parties and to have an intense one-on-one connection with someone at that party, which would have been more of the sexual subtype, or the transmitting. And that was a lot more important than what kind of food was being served there, which is more the preserving. How many of you think you're clear on your stacking? Which one of these you tend to over-focus on?
Ashley?
Okay, in middle, and okay. How about the rest of you? Candace, Mary, Kelly, Louise, Gary?
I feel like it's hard to separate like domestic roles from what you do, because I feel like I've just like taken on like paying bills and organizing meal plans, but you're like, is that out of necessity or out of my soul longing and gifts?
Yeah, well, see, that's an exceptionally important comment, right? You need to pay attention. We all need to pay attention. Are we paying enough, or do we establish enough priority in each of these 3 areas so there's a balance? And to know what that stacking is and whether it serves us and others we care about, or whether or not it's out of balance. So I think what you're raising is a really good question. And something to be aware of, right? Just pay attention to it.
Yeah, and is it something that you'd be drawn to do no matter what, or just something that you feel like you have to do because of a role, whether it's, as a parent, as a family member? is it a natural draw, or is it something you have to do? If it's natural, then there's probably very little resistance to doing it.
Well, but then there's also socialization, as we all know. And if you're playing a role in a way that is honoring your socialization and not so much your preference, it's something to be aware of. It doesn't mean that socialization is wrong, but it can overprivilege what we're to do if we're not aware enough to analyze how much of a balance we have.
Yeah,
Okay.
and also important to realize that what we pay attention to may or may not be reflected in behavior. So you can be a hermit and be a social subtype because you're always thinking about your relationships with others, even if you're not going out and doing something with it. And some Enneagram books talk about the one-on-one type, but a lot of teachers, including Russ Hudson, who we particularly like, don't like that at all because everyone likes one-on-one interactions. Very few people go
Most
to a party.
everyone, we shouldn't say.
Yeah, I mean, very few people go to a party and want to interact with everyone at one time, but one-on-one relationships look very different. I think it was Russ who used the example of there's a one-on-one relationship. Unfortunately, this is going to date us, but like if anyone watched The Bunkers, All in the Family, where there was a husband and wife who had their favorite chairs and they always sat in the same chairs and watched the same TV shows, who had a very strong one-on-one relationship that was very self-preservation. And then the example that's used of a very different kind of one-on-one relationship is Richard Burton and Elizabeth Taylor, who got married and divorced 3 times or something, and couldn't stand to be with each other or without each other. That's overly focused on one-on-one in a transmitting or sexual subtype.
Strange contact.
So the centers, we want to just make sure that these are clear. There are these 3 centers.
And these are associated with specific Enneagram types.
Yeah.
Doesn't mean we don't have all 3 of these centers. Ooh.
This one has sound attached. Sorry.
Ooh. Sorry about that. Yeah.
Yeah. So you can see the issues. If you're one of these 3 types, we mentioned.
I'm trying to find the area, the place in the book. My book is not correct. Take a look and find the 3 centers. Look in your table of contents in the beginning of your book, and it'll tell you where the 3 centers are, right?
Yeah. And again, the slides are here if you don't have it.
Yeah, we have the slide. Pardon?
Page 12, I think.
Okay, page 12.
Okay.
The 3 centers. And
Yeah.
again, these are associated with specific types. It doesn't mean if this is something really important to you that it isn't part of how you function. It just is typically the instinctual belly center is associated with 8s, 9s, and 1s.
And so you can see whether these.
Sounds like we're shooting some shapes.
Yeah, you can see whether those bullets relate to sort of
Bullets?
core issues in your type. Autonomy, not being messed with. Is this something that is a major part of your life? Is this sort of the core issue that you really deal with?
And it's a part of a lot of people's lives, but is it a major, like he says, core?
Yeah.
And again, associated with 8s, 9s, and 1s, but it doesn't mean that there aren't some of these priorities in all of us.
Yeah, and the next slide, we haven't shown it to you in this way. Hopefully it's not going to keep, oh, sorry about the sounds. Can't do anything about it. There's 3 directions of dealing with that resistance. One of them is outwardly. So the Enneagram 8, I resist outwardly. The Enneagram 1 on the right, I control myself. So it's, that controlling is done inward.
Well, I want to add something to that. But while I'm controlling myself, what's my message to others? If I'm a 1? And I'm doing it right, so pay attention. This is at the average level. Okay.
Yeah, and the Enneagram 9 does it both ways. I'm both controlling myself by withdrawing and finding peace inside. And I'm trying to control outside of me by getting people to not bother me, by going along, avoiding conflict, things like that.
And where I can ensure that I'm comfortable and hopefully people around me are comfortable.
Yeah. And so you can ask yourself, again, if this is your major center, if these issues are, because just to combine this with the Hornavians, which is how I get my needs met, there's an assertive way of dealing with anger, autonomy, not being messed with. So which type would that be? Which type is assertive out of these three?
Remember, if I must, go ahead, Kelly, did you?
8?
Correct.
Yes.
Yeah. So either I'll be strong enough that you can't mess with me,
Mhm.
or the dutiful one, Enneagram 1, I'm going to be such a perfect version of a human being that you can't mess with me. Or the withdrawn variation, which is 9. You won't be able to really find me, comfortably numb. So then you won't mess with me because I'm just going to be so nice and I'm agreeable and nod my head and such a wonderful person. So you can see how the centers then meet up with the Hornavians, how I get my needs met.
Okay, let's move to the feeling center. And again, we all have feelings. These, geez.
I'll go through them quickly. So there we go.
But for the 2s, 3s, and 4s, feelings are a major focus, much with emotion. Again, there's some sex-typed socialization, which males are not to show emotions in a lot of ways if it's a stereotypical environment, and females are expected to. And we know that those are stereotypes, but they're there. And that can complicate, not always, but it can complicate us being aware. So take a look as we talk about the feeling center, go ahead and read about the qualities of being. And that doesn't mean in those qualities of being that other types can't be incredibly sensitive and heartfelt, but these are some basic qualities of being for the 2.
Yeah, and remember that if you're in this triad, these are not nice to have, these are have to have, and these are have to have all the time. I use an example sometimes as an Enneagram 3 of being in a class in graduate school that was marked on a curve, 3 tests, each one marked on a perfect curve. And so I knew that no matter what I did, basically in the final, I get an A in the course. And I also knew that if I did nothing, probably the worst I get would be like a B, B minus, because I followed the material and I knew it. So then the question was, while all of my classmates were studying late into the night, could I go off and party? Could I stand to turn in a paper that was a B or a B minus? And the answer for me was, nope. I had to turn in an A plus because I couldn't stand the thought of the professor getting a paper, that's the imaginary audience, and going, Joel, turn this in. Now there's other types that might like to be liked and like to get good grades, but they would go, party time, this is, beer and pizza time, or whatever. But I couldn't do it because it was a have to have all the time.
One of the things that I noticed with autonomy and being an 8 is that what can happen is I can put too much force forward. And what I have had to learn is often that was a reactive stance that is not required of me, but it was certainly something I had to learn in development.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
And so again, there are going to be 3 variations of this need to be valued. There's going to be the assertive one, which is which? What would be the assertive version of the feeling center? What was that, Kelly?
3.
Yeah, that's right. I'm going to go directly for the goals. I'm going to achieve directly. Then there's the dutiful type, which is 2. I'm going to be such a nice person.
That you'll need me. You'll
Yeah.
want me around.
And then there's the withdrawn type, which is 4, which is, there's two ways 4s do this as a withdrawn type. And one of them is, I'm focused a lot on my own feelings, my own interior, but also I kind of want people to chase me. I'd like to, if I pull back, I want you to follow me.
Well, that's to confirm that I'm valuable, because I have a sense at the low average level that people just don't get me. Remember the uniqueness.
Yeah.
So that's 2, 3.
Yeah, and so again, I don't know we have to keep doing this, but you can see that the 2 is outwardly directed, the 4 is inwardly directed, and the 3 both. So the 3 is both deceiving self. I already think I'm who I should be. And again, not consciously, but I'm kind of deceiving others because I'm creating an image that I think you'll love and value.
Mhm.
Okay, we'll get the sounds over with.
Oh, jeez.
Actually, it was Russ who made these slides.
What?
But
We know where to get him. Okay.
you can see how the thinking center is, again, very different.
This is safety and security, which we all want a version of. But look at how the safety and security is being defined here in the thinking center. Okay, this is 5s, 6s, and 7s. And so we all think, but 5s, 6s, and 7s seem or tend to defer to thinking.
Yeah.
And you know, at the high level, there is an inner guidance that the 5s, 6s, and 7s get, and they count on that, and it's really a gift.
Yeah. And so if safety and security is really what drives your life, you'll see again the different versions of this. There's the assertive type, 7. I'm going to go out and look for security. I'm going to find as many pleasurable activities as I can. And if I can, you know, the self-preservation variation would be if I can just acquire enough toys, you know, then I'll be safe and secure. But I'm going out looking for experience and really running away from my inner anxiety.
And if I'm bored, I'm going to make it known.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Then there's
things aren't exciting enough.
Then there's the withdrawn type. You can see the 5 on here, which is I'm going to find security by knowing enough and by being hard to find, by not sharing too much about me and what's really going on.
But we have to look at it. It depends on the level of that 5, because it may be that the 5 doesn't ever give themselves credit for knowing enough. That will just reinforce the withdrawn. And the 7 doesn't want to take the time to find out whether or not people get it, that they are about enthusiasm. They just get in and take over. That's at the lowest.
Sorry, is 6 dutiful?
Yes.
Yes.
6 is dutiful.
Okay.
And so if I'm a 6, I'm both focused externally, like, am I a good team player? Do I have people around who I think are safety and security? But I'm also controlling my own anxiety internally with trying to have belief systems or other ways of reducing that natural angst in me.
Remember, because I'm afraid, all right, and that's how I'm going to. 5, 6s, and 7s are all fear types, but the 6 is very overtly dealing with, if I don't take care of safety, I won't be safe.
And then 1 and 2 are also dutiful?
Yes,
Mm-hmm.
exactly.
Okay.
Yeah, in fact.
But dutiful to the images that have been described.
Yes, yes.
Yeah, so we actually covered these already, but just to do what you're doing, the Hornavians, again, are how we deal with, how we get our needs met, and the dutiful types. So now you know these are 1, 2, and 6. And you can see the different, if you're thinking that you're one of those types, 1, 2, or 6, see how much this relates to you now, because we showed you these on the first day, but now there's more meaning. I feel like I have to earn the right to get my needs met. I consider myself extremely responsible. You can see these, you know, my superego, my internal shoulds. I'm very compliant to those. And some of those ones, like I secretly feel better than other people. You know, the world would be a better place if more people were like me. And then you see the last 2, which you might not have without self-awareness, that I use rules and beliefs to replace inner guidance because I don't really know what to do on my own. And I'm usually out of touch with the wisdom of a quiet mind. All three of them, 1, 2, and 6.
And I probably don't know that. My mind is taken over.
Yeah, so now we're just looking directly at these Hornevian types. The withdrawn types, which you now
Hornevians,
know.
yeah. Did somebody find it in the book, the page numbers?
Oh, I had that back there on the first slide. I think it was 2021, something
Is
like
it
that.
2021? Okay. All right.
But you can see.
Do you see the dutiful, withdrawn, and assertive on the page? 2 pages. All right.
Yeah. So you can see again, this is very. So now, if you think that you are 4, 5, or 9, see whether you relate to these. You know, I go inside to get my needs met. Easy to zone out. Easily feel overwhelmed. Often not very assertive, competitive.
Doesn't mean we can't all feel overwhelmed. It's when these things show up as a group of bullet items on a regular basis.
Yeah, and difficulty moving into action, often.
Where the assertive types, that's the opposite.
Yeah.
Dutiful types are doing it right according to their own theory of what's right.
Yeah, again, if you think you might be one of these types, do you relate to, I can easily feel left out, like I don't really fit in or belong. And then the last ones are the assertive types, who demand what they want.
Again, that's the demand can be at that average level at the highest, not at the high level, because the demand, a person at the high level is going to be checking out what others need, what they need, what the context needs. But that's not possible at that average level or demand what I want. And if I'm an assertive type, I'm going to express it.
So you can see the assertive types expect to be noticed. The withdrawn types almost expect to not be noticed.
But those decisions we want to go back to are made when we're very, very young. I don't want to be noticed in interactions with other people, just too much if I'm a withdrawn type. Assertive type, that's my safety. Okay.
And you see that all 3 assertive types, and 3, 7s, and 8s, have difficulty connecting to an open heart. They can act like it, but it's harder to experience it directly, which explains some of the intensity of assertive types, almost like I'm making up for the fact that I don't have direct access to my heart a lot of the time.
And hopefully you remember that we made the distinction between assertion and aggression. And so for someone to be assertive, that's clear, direct, and respectful. On a classic theoretical sense, aggressive is where I'm not respectful. So I have to look at how that assertiveness shows up.
Any questions, again, because we've covered that now from 2 different directions. Okay. The next triad that we covered when we had our day 1, but now again, this will have more meaning as you know the types more. Harmonics, which is my first reaction when the blank hits the fan, my first reaction when things don't go well. And so you can see, that's page 22 and 23 on your book.
Good.
So there are the positive outlook types, and now you know those are 2, 7, and 9. Positive outlook is, hey, we can do better, and we've handled things like this before. Let's look at the bright side. How can we make this fun? How can I be of assistance to you? Kind of don't worry, be happy. We can get through this.
But again, developmentally, I'm going to overprivilege being positive if I'm at that average to low average level. At a high level, that positive outlook is not out of touch with what's taking place.
And this will be really interesting when we know all the types on your team in our next group meeting, and we look at how this plays out. Because again, well, we'll do all 3 types. We'll do 3 and talk about how they tend to relate to each other. So this is a positive outlook type. Hey, it's okay, not a problem. The competency group let's be big boys and big girls.
1s, 3s, and 5s.
Put our feelings aside and just solve the problem. Don't have all these feelings, none of this reactivity. Stop that Pollyanna positive outlook. Let's just get down and figure out what we're going to do. Now that, you know, the blankets hit the fan, what are we going to do? What are our next steps? Again, be big boys, big girls, put our feelings aside. And 1, 3, and 5 all have that. And the reactive group, or sometimes called the intensity group, 4, 6, and 8. First, I got to blow off some steam. I'm frustrated, I'm angry, I'm pissed off, I'm whatever. Once ideally, you'll mirror me. I'm pissed off too, or I'm frustrated too, or I'm sad too. At least I hope you're validated. Oh, I can see why you're so frustrated. And then I can move on quickly. But don't just tell me, calm down. Can you just take a deep breath? So hopefully you can see, we probably shouldn't take too much time on this, how we'll be curious how this plays out on your team, because each type tends to judge the other 2 types as really dealing with things incorrectly.
How about questions about any of these?
Or
Comments?
any smiles of recognition about how this plays out at Bissell Center? Ashley, something you want to add? Ashley,
I'm just agreeing that, yeah, I see how it plays out.
and how does it play out there? What do you notice?
Exactly what you said. I'm just agreeing with you.
Yeah. This is one that may be the most powerful with personal relationships as well. You know, I'm a competency type. If there's an issue between us, I want to solve it. But what can we do next? What's the solution? When Sandra, who's a reactive or intensity type, really wants to be met first, wants me to understand the experience that just happened. And I want to quickly move on and solve it in a rational way. And when we do that, we don't meet.
Yeah, so that's the beauty that the Enneagram can bring to relationships as well, so that we can see that we have different drives. And if we're well developed enough, we can work that out between us. We are 2 assertive types, and you can imagine 2 assertive types in one relationship can cause overreaction at each other. And so learning to, the assertiveness is not negative at all, but it can overwhelm. And each desiring to be heard. So it's just, there's, again, gifts not just to us as individuals, but to all of us in relationships and at work.
Yeah, and I wanted to add that the instinctual variants also play a big role in relationships. We just had a meeting, I think last week, with, he happens to be an Enneagram 7 leader, it doesn't really matter, but he runs a company here in town. And he was talking about what's been happening with COVID and with all the pressure and having a young one and dealing with things. And he said he finally realized, he wasn't using this language, but he is a self-pres type. His way of showing love was to do things, to shop, to do chores, to fix that thing that had been bugging his wife, to make the dinner, to make sure that he was the one, doing the laundry or whatever, that it was acts of service that to him were the way he was going to show love. The way he described his wife, we haven't worked with her, it sounds like she's a sexual subtype or transmitting. She wanted the direct connection. She wanted to be with him and feel like we are actually having quality time, you and me, we're connecting. And he realized he was missing her. He was doing all the things that he thought was showing how important she was to him, but not doing the one thing that actually would signal to her how important she was. Does that make sense? So the instinctual variants are really useful in relationships.
So comments, questions about any of this?
So is this last bit something where, again, it's sort of like we all have it, it's just what we lean to?
Yes. Well, if
we have all of them, sorry.
We have all those reactions in us. It's which one do we tend to lean on too much? And that's why this can be really useful to ask, how did this play out, for example, when the Expo Center closed down? You know, were there positive outlooks on your team? Okay, yeah, but hey, but it was a great experience, wasn't it? And let's move on to the next experience. Were there reactive types who needed to really process? And the first thing was, I got to tell you, I'm really upset by this. Was that annoying to the competency types who think that those kind of things get in the way of being effective and moving forward? You know, how do these things play out in real life becomes useful. So yes, we have all three types, all three reactions in us. But if you're a 1, 3, or 5, you're very likely a competency type. If you're 7, 9, or 2, you're very likely a positive alpha type. 4, 6, and 8 reactive type.
Does that help, Gary?
Yeah, I just think I can think of instances for all three of these.
Yeah, but
Sure.
Go ahead.
no, I was going to say what you want to do is start to observe yourself, so, or those you're in relationship with or building groups with. What tends to bear out over time.
Sure.
Okay, and obviously there's gifts in all of this, and overdone, these are a problem. Okay, so we have to pay attention to what reactions am I getting, am I noticing, and especially if I am doing something constructive, like what is it I want to contribute, and not just to me but to others as well.
Yeah,
Okay.
and again, this hopefully all helps triangulate on what your type is, because the Enneagram has very little value if you don't get your type right.
That's right.
I think I said this before, that my experience is when I do something and I wish I hadn't done it, I can probably track it to 90% related to my Enneagram type's downside.
Yeah, and the Enneagram type will show up in varying levels, sometimes very subtle, sometimes gross, throughout our whole life. So it's really important to get that core type correct. And as Gary points out, we have all 9 types in us, but that core type really drives.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so the only other thing would be the wallpaper really quickly.
Which is on page 26 to 27.
Yeah, just take a look at that. The attachment wallpaper.
First one here is let's just go through this line.
This is 3, 6, and 9, attachment wallpaper.
No,
this is the surround. When you think about wallpaper, it surrounds if it happens to be in a room. Okay.
Yeah, so think about this again. I hold on to things too long, even when it doesn't really serve me anymore. And so again, we asked you this without knowing the Enneagram types before. Now it'll have more meaning. I want to keep a stable relationship with something. And you see that there's 3 very different ways that this shows up. I think we have a slide that shows this. So,
frustration, rejection. Yeah.
So the 3, I'm going to hold on to whatever I do for approval. So even if it doesn't serve me anymore, if I've had a role and I'm getting approval for it, it's very unlikely I'm going to say, yes, I've done great as, a scientist, but I think I'm just going to stop and do pottery. Because if being a scientist is getting me external validation, I'm going to stick with it. You see the Enneagram 6 version. I hang on to beliefs and people that I associate with security.
That's right, because that's my major priority. Again, we're talking at the average level. At a high level, I'm going to know I tend to do that, and I'm going to be able, just like with all of this, I'm going to be able to assess whether or not it's serving me and others to the degree that I believe meets my values.
And you see the Enneagram 9 version is I hang on to patterns and routines. 9s, if any of you relate to being a 9, the principle of inertia. An object in motion tends to remain in motion, an object at rest tends to remain at rest, is very much an Enneagram 9 thing, which is why if 9s get good habits, they tend to be really consistent with them. But they tend to be creatures of habits and hang on to habits even when they stopped serving them.
Yeah. Okay. Comments, questions? All right, let's take on the frustration wallpaper. This is interesting. You often will hear some version from ones, especially when they're really frustrated, is I wouldn't know who I was if I wasn't frustrated. See, that's a clue, isn't it? That if most of the time I'm spending frustrated, it's something for me to be aware of. But I can't unless, again, like we've said many, many times, unless I'm practicing and have the capacity to ask myself, is this frustration simply my patterned reaction, or is it warranted? Just like with all the rest of this.
Yeah, and the frustration one is really interesting because 3 frustration types can look so different. So 1, 4, and 7 can seem quite different. But you see the one version, like Sandra said, I'm never good enough. I have to keep improving myself. I'm never who I should be. The world's never who it should be. And again, if I woke up one morning and I was totally at peace, I'd wonder which alien took over my body. I just expect there to be this nagging tension of frustration.
But think of the pressure that a 1 puts themselves under when their job is to get it done right.
But the 4 has just as much frustration. I'm not who I should be. I still get the sense of something wrong with me, and if I could just correct my tragic flaw, then I would be loved.
Or people just don't get me.
So I have to keep working on myself and working on myself, but it's never enough. And then the other one that people get surprised at is a 7. I keep looking for these positive experiences, but it's never quite good enough. Now, part of that is because when the 7 isn't totally present, they're always thinking about the next possible adventure, so it's hard to just enjoy what they're doing. But there's a chronic, I can't get no satisfaction, that's very much part of the 7. So all 3 of these types actually experience frustration most of the time.
And we all can experience frustration. It's just more clear with 1, 4s, and 7s at the level that we're talking about.
Yeah, and the last one, and this is an interesting one because not all of these types relate to this really, but it's the sense that my wallpaper, my emotional background is rejection.
Okay, and that can be anything from my ideas to me as a person to how I stand in a group, all of that.
Yeah, and all 3 types tend to have difficulties with their own vulnerabilities.
2, 5s, and 8s.
Yeah, so very different. A 2, because the world's a dangerous place and I'm worried about being rejected, I'm going to be so helpful that you just can't reject me.
And then, of course, at some point, I get over the top and I'm burned out and I don't know that I created that.
Yeah, or I've been so intrusive that you don't want to be around me anymore. The 5 version, if I just knew enough, you can't reject me. And also, if you can't find me, then you can't reject me either.
And remember I said that 5s can tend to be lonely and they don't realize they create that isolation themselves.
Yeah. And you also see, and they're not all 5s, but a lot of 5s are minimalists. They take pride in needing very little. And that's also a way to minimize my own needs so I can't be rejected as much. And then the 8 version, I'm going to be so strong that you won't dare reject me.
But just like with the 5, that's where the 8 can cut themselves off from contact with others because that strength is code for a wall of safety.
Yeah, but it doesn't mean it's not in the background. Just a quick example and then we have to stop. I was coaching this very gruff male 8, sort of your typical major corporate, no nonsense, tough as nails. And I remember after working with him for a while, in a moment of vulnerability, he said, I wonder why people don't invite me to their birthday parties. Sort of that core, vulnerable, internal being showed a little bit, but nobody would know how much he felt hurt that he wasn't invited to their parties, which is probably why he was never invited to their parties.